This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Risk exists in every corner of our professional and personal lives. Risk is something we as leaders cannot and should not shy from. Risk can be expressed as a simple mathematical equation, threat times vulnerability. But in practice, risk is quite complex. How we choose to detect, assess, respond, and learn from risk determines if our organizations, and us as leaders, succeed or fail. I'm joined in this episode by one of the most impactful leaders of modern time. General Stan McChrystal reached our nation's highest military rank. He commanded all American and international forces in Afghanistan. He's credited with transforming the most elite special operations to combat global terrorism. He's also a scholar, a diplomat, an entrepreneur, and one of the finest gentlemen I've ever met. For this conversation, I also asked Lisa Jaster to join me as a guest host. Lisa was my guest on episode 16. She's the third woman to graduate from U.S. Army Ranger School. She leads hundreds of soldiers as an officer in the Army Reserve, and she sets the example for risk mitigation as both an engineer and in her remarkable efforts to close the gender gap and delete the adjective. Stan, Lisa, and I break down Stan's new book, Risk, A User's Guide. We define the risk immune system and explain how the 10 factors of control guide us in understanding and mitigating risk by taking action. We tie in Afghanistan as Stan provides his assessment of the 20-year global war on terror. He breaks down the decisions behind the withdrawal, and he shares his insight on the next battlefield. This is our Veterans Day episode. In honor of all those who've served our nation, we each provide our thoughts on America today, our position as the bastion of hope and freedom in the world, and how we all come together as Americans to build a resilient future. General McChrystal, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Well, start by calling me Stan, if you would.
I will.
That's going to be impossible, sir. Just throwing it out there right in the beginning.
If I've got disabled people, come on here. Yeah.
We had former acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller, on not too long ago, and he did the same thing to me. And I kept calling him sir, and he was sitting next to me, and he hit me. You can't see it because we didn't have any video. And he's like, will you stop calling me sir? And I said, no, you were the Secretary of Defense. I will not.
I won't hit you. I'll kick you under the table.
Perfect.
And also, Lisa, thanks for joining us again. You know, special guest host here, and you joined us in episode 16, and we told your story, and it's awesome to have you here again. And we'll talk about risk. We'll talk about so many things with the General, but great to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Fran.
I was going to say sir, but Stan, you've led organizations of every size and every capability. You achieved our nation's highest military rank. You served in the most chaotic and confusing areas of the world. You shaped policy at the strategic level in the U.S. government and the international community. You created impact at the tactical level down to the lowest soldier and the newest soldier and private in the military. You led forces in Afghanistan. You commanded our nation's most elite combat units in Joint Special Operations Command. You were the regimental commander of the Rangers. You led forces in the 82nd Airborne Division, a premier infantry force.
And sounds like you're giving my eulogy. I'm not dead yet.
You got more time. I'm not worried. You're also a best-selling author, member of several boards, a Yale Fellow, an entrepreneur in your own right. But most importantly to me, and for our discussion, you're a fellow Green Beret. You come from the Jedburgh lineage that we tell. You display the character traits that we talk so much about on our podcast. And I'm honored to sit here with both of you today. Yesterday, Lisa came in and she posted on Instagram, it said, mission top secret, destination unknown. And here we are in an undisclosed location in New Haven, Connecticut. It's our Veterans Day episode of the podcast, and I couldn't be more proud and honored to sit with two of our nation's finest leaders.
Well, I'm humbled to be with both of you, so thanks for having me.
There's so many places we could start this conversation, and each one of them could be its own episode. I interviewed Jack Devine, former director of operations at the CIA, and he told me that every one of my questions you could write a book on, and I reminded him that he did write a book, and the whole purpose of the discussion was to talk about his book, so he's spot on. And we're here and we're going to do that, and I know I'm going to do that to you, so bear with me as we dig in. I was also told by Olympian and one of rowing's greatest of all time, Jevy Stone, that hard things bond people together more than easy things. And as I sit here with you two today, and I read your book and I finished it a couple of days ago, there's a section of it I want to quote because I think it bonds the three of us. And it's that, quote, "I chose a soldier's life for many reasons, one of which was the desire to perceive myself as a courageous risk taker. I liked the idea of taking risks that others would not. Like other comrades I would eventually serve alongside, I pursued becoming a paratrooper, a ranger, a Green Beret, and I joined elite units partly for the cachet of appearing to disdain risks others shrank from." The three of us in this room sit here as individuals, but we are bonded by so many hard things. 3 Rangers, although I have to quantify that you led and commanded the Ranger Regiment. We are simply Ranger qualified.
Just tabbed.
Yeah, that's it. I don't want hate mail.
It's a
from
pretty
all the
big deal.
Just tabbed. Right? Telling me something. 3 Army officers, 2 West Pointers. I was an OCS graduate, but we have no ROTC easy day people in here. But 3 leaders, and 3 leaders that commanded in the Army and have moved on to civilian careers. Lisa continues to serve and leads parallel lives in her civilian career.
And we work together now because she does work with McChrystal Group. So
yeah,
it's pretty special.
Right. Bonded by hardship and hard lessons learned. But it's all about risk. And what has brought us together, what has brought so many like us together is that assumption of risk and that desire to be in this chaotic and confusing situation that requires you to truly be a leader. Otherwise, if we don't push our organizations to and past their breaking point, we don't learn from them. And I want to get into risk right here off the start. You just wrote the book. It's something that you have managed at all levels of your career. We're going to tie in the 9 soft characteristics of elite performance as we go: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. But I think we need to start by defining risk. You said that the greatest risk to us as individuals and to our organizations is us. Why?
Well, if you think about how we traditionally define risk, I always thought of it as the intersection between the probability of something happening and the consequences if it did. If I climb up on the roof of my house, what's the likelihood I'll fall off? And if I fall off, will I get hurt? Now I think about it more like a mathematical equation, and this is sort of the limit of my mathematical ability.
So I studied journalism, so I didn't have to take math.
Good on you. There are threats out there, and they are those things that external, like mostly, and they come at us. But, if you think about it, we're not very good at predicting them. And if we can predict that a threat is coming, we're not very good at predicting what it's going to be. But we know that they are largely inevitable. And yet we spend an amazing amount of our ability as individuals and organizations, our energy, trying to look over the horizon and see what's coming or around the corner or in the dark. And they did this fascinating interview with a number of CEOs some years ago, and they asked them what were the biggest threats to their corporations. And they uniformly all listed external threats. And then they looked at organizations that failed, and almost all of them failed for internal reasons. And so when I think now of this mathematical equations, I say, okay, I can't do much about the threats, but what's the other part of it? It's threats times vulnerability equals the level of risk we have. Now, if we can do away with all our threats, good on us. We've got no risk because anything times 0 is 0. But we can't do that. At least I don't know how to. So now you look at vulnerabilities and you say, well, I probably can't do all my vulnerabilities down to 0. But what if I am better prepared? What if I communicate better? What if I'm in better shape? Like you talk about the special operations attributes, and we think about if you're in really good physical shape and you're pretty adaptable and you're well-informed, suddenly your vulnerabilities go way down to whatever threat arises. And so because we have control over that, that's where I argue we should focus. Because when we talk about the greatest risk to us is us, what we mean is because we don't pay attention to decreasing our vulnerabilities. We don't make ourselves what we call risk fit.
I think about this, and I think about it in terms of almost like an acceptance of your role as a leader and having to say, risk exists around me. That makes me think about ownership. And so there's this element of responsibility, and then there's this element of accountability, the acceptance of risk, and my kind of, I guess I'd call it, in security, we call it risk appetite. And what's our risk appetite? And then you take that and you say, well, now I have to have ownership in this. When you look at organizations and where leaders sit in organizations and how they have to assess it, can you talk a little bit about how you define ownership, accountability, responsibility, and really getting someone to say, yes, I have to make decisions. I have to be a leader here. I have to actually take action.
Absolutely. Remember when I was a brand new second lieutenant, my father was an Army officer, and he'd served in Korea and Vietnam. And I asked him, how do you know if a person's going to be a good commander in combat? And he looked at me, he says, you won't until you're in combat. And I was very disappointed. I said, we ought to be able to analyze that. And I said, what will you see? He says, the ones who aren't good at it will ask for more and more information or intelligence. And what they're doing is they're trying to drive risk to zero. They're trying to get perfect knowledge. So in fact, there's not much uncertainty involved in a decision. The problem is that's, one, practically impossible. And two, that's not why we hire leaders. We put leaders in positions to take very difficult, sometimes hazy situations and make bold, but probability-based rational decisions as best as they possibly can. If you expand that to organizations or bureaucracies, many times what I found was people in a bureaucracy want to avoid risk. In the counterterrorist world, what would happen is we'd have an opportunity arise, and we'd have to go up the chain of command, sometimes all the way to the White House to get approval to take action. And in a number of occasions, we'd go up one or two levels in the chain, and somebody would come back and ask us a question. Well, you've given me this information, but how much wood can a woodchuck chuck? And I'd go, what are you talking about? There's no woodchucks involved here. And they would say, well, I need to know that before I put my approval on it and it goes up. And invariably, we'd go back and we'd try to get whatever the information was. And when we did go back, often the opportunity had passed or the risk had already manifested itself. And I'd go to that decision maker and I'd say, well, we missed it. And they'd go, damn it, Stan, I really wanted to approve that. You should have come better prepared. Now, what they were doing was not making a decision. They weren't taking responsibility for approving it or for disapproving it. What they'd done is they'd sidestepped. And they had the effect of disapproving it, but without their fingerprints on it. Mm-hmm. And bureaucracies do that almost naturally because there's often an avoidance of responsibility. And there's an anonymity in bureaucracies that allows you to do that. Think how often we punish someone who's involved in a failed operation if they're in the decision-making chain. But how often do we go back on a missed opportunity and say, here was the cost of not doing something, and who was involved in that? I can't remember a time really we've done that. And so I think that the idea of creating an idea of responsibility for decision-making, the old idea of the buck stops here. Sometimes you have to change the idea that says the responsibility to arrive at a decision rests with me. I can't sidestep it. I have to own that.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, when you look at your organization, because you're in command now,
right,
and you start to develop your subordinate leaders, how do you get them to understand the level at which they can make a decision? And I quantify that because the military, when you look at the risk assessment matrix, right? I mean, this thing is so built out, and you add the controls and the mitigating factors, and then it brings a whole number system that brings you down.
Yes.
And then based on what that residual risk level is, right, then that tells you who actually has to approve it, what level can approve it. How do you get those in your command to understand and actually then accept that, oh, I'm comfortable now making a decision and not doing what Stan said, which is either sidestepping it or trying to push it up when it unnecessarily needs to be pushed up? And then you look at it and go, why am I even looking at this thing?
Right. Oddly enough, as a battalion commander, the very first thing I did was I've got 8 company commanders, and I bought 8 copies plus some for my staff, The Men, the Mission, and Me. And one of the underlying themes throughout that entire book is that the guy on the ground really knows what's going on, which ties very directly into many of your stories in Team of Teams, of course. But, that person has such a better sight picture. And I have both sets of commanders in my down trace units right now. I have the guy who never tells me what's going on, and I'm calling him going, hey, I need something. And I have the other guy who said, oh, COVID started and we don't have masks. Okay, figure it out. Like, you're a captain. Go to Walmart, buy a box of 50. It'll take 2 seconds. And so I have both spectrums, both ends of the spectrum, which is why I love that book. Of course, getting 8 guys to read that while they're in company command is pretty difficult. So the conversation I often have is, you have to own it. So would you feel comfortable calling me after you made the decision and said, I made this decision? And if you are, then definitely make that decision. Like, go forth. And if you go to your right-hand man, your first sergeant, your senior enlisted advisor, and the two of you can talk about it and you have a warm fuzzy, like you feel good about it, then make the decision. But always just follow up with a text message. And that's why I loved today's technology. That's where technology is an asset, because I can get an immediate text message saying, hey, I had to make this decision and here's where it's going. And that allows me to power down to lower levels because I am readily available because of technology.
And that's then building the system, right? And the system's what has to permeate more than the individuals, right? Yes. It has to live, and that creates resiliency within it.
Let me ask both of you a question, because when you're first as a leader, you will call it second lieutenant, but also the first time you're in command as a captain, did you ever feel good when people came to you with decisions, even though you knew they were decisions that other people below you could make, but you felt needed, you felt important? Did you ever feel that?
I think at first you definitely do, especially if you're new to the organization, because you're like, oh, they actually value my input, especially in like special operations, right, where you have, when I showed up at my team sergeant, first question he asked me, I didn't know me from anything. He just said, how long have you been in the Army? Like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. And he's like, great, I've had 20 years in 10th group. Yeah. And I'm looking at this guy like, oh man, okay. So, and I think at first it does make you feel good because you feel valued, you feel like your input's important. And then as you build the relationship, you build the trust and confidence, then eventually you're like, why are you coming to me with that?
Exactly.
I've been in an interesting state since West Point, and then I was already commissioned when September 11th occurred. Well, I had so many additional duties immediately, and I'm a degreed engineer. And so when I first went to Kandahar, Afghanistan, I was the only degreed engineer there. So I had to use my 4 years of engineering experience as if I was a professional engineer. I had to answer real world questions and be a platoon leader with Jordanians assigned to me and Canadians assigned to me and German bomb dogs, because we were doing minefield clearing operations. So it was just too much. So even as a lieutenant, I was doling out as much as I could. Hey, if you're a high-speed specialist, boom, you're now a corporal. And I had corporals, starting on that deployment. And by the time I got to company command, I did it to my lieutenants, and my captains, if they ever listen to this, will start giggling, because the only thing I tell them I rate them on with regards to their evaluation reports is their ability to deliver through others. And that is, I tell them, you get ranked 1 through 8 on your ability to deliver through others. So for me, I've just been too overwhelmed to do anything less. It does feel good for about 30 seconds, right, and then it's too much. And I feel like in battalion command, I say pretty regularly, okay, it's just too much. It's too much. You take care of this. You take care of this.
Okay, that's great. I do want to set the record straight. I also have a 4-year degree in engineering. But if you ever come to a bridge and my name is on it, do not cross it. Your life is in danger.
Well, Lisa teaches in the Risk Academy at the McChrystal Group. You've developed what's called what you're calling the risk immune system. And there's 4 critical functions of the risk immune system: detect, assess, respond, and learn. Can you talk about these 4 functions and the importance of them and how they make up this risk immune system?
Absolutely. I'm going to back up, because we really drew this from an analogy to the human immune system. Mm-hmm. And some years ago, when I was up at Yale teaching, a young immunologist came and told me that the human immune system is like counterinsurgency. And I said, what do you know about counterinsurgency? And she says, nothing really, but I'd done a little reading. And of course, she's brilliant.
I Googled it.
Yes, but she did, more than I knew about the human immune system. But as we studied, and we did a project on it together, as we studied it, it was exactly right. Because a human immune system detects those things which come at us every day, and it's estimated 10,000 microorganisms come into our body a day that could kill us or make us sick. It then assesses every one of them to determine if it's dangerous to us. It responds by killing it or not, and then it learns so that it's better next time. And yet we have this miracle system. We don't worry too much about it unless we're immune compromised. We just kind of get up in the morning and go about our lives. But yet, when we look at why organizations or individuals struggle with risk, it's because we're not very good at detecting, assessing, responding, and learning to the threats that come at us. And if you only think of the things that actually get to you, not the things that are over the horizon and might come, but the things that actually arrive, if we put ourselves in a position where we're able to do those 4 steps, assess those things, detect them, assess them, then respond effectively and learn from it, we get better every time. Suddenly we put in place resilience that we just won't have otherwise. And so when we talk about the greatest risk to us is us, it's when we neglect that risk immune system.
What about the 10 factors of control, which is now kind of how do you actually break this down once you've gone through the 4 functions? And you've called them a set of dials that we can adjust or calibrate to improve the operation of the risk immune system. And I'll list them and then we can get into a couple of them. But narrative, structure, technology, diversity, bias, action, timing, adaptability, leadership, and communication. So first I'll ask, why these 10? And can you talk maybe about the interrelated nature of them?
Absolutely. As we tried to decide what are the things that an organization, and we thought mostly about organizations, have to be able to do effectively, we came up with 10. We could have had 12, could have had 8 by putting some together, but we wanted to make it clear for people. So for example, we talk about communication. Any organization that doesn't communicate internally is dead in the water. Mm-hmm. If we want to defeat an enemy army, the first thing we do is cut their communications. Then they can't collaborate, coordinate, and they're done. But some are more subtle, like a narrative. You know, narratives are what we say about ourselves and what we think about ourselves. In the book, we talk about when a narrative isn't effective for an organization. In 1957, then Vice President Nixon goes to Ghana for Independence Day. And he is walking around just sort of making conversation with people. And he goes to a black man and he says, so how does it feel to be free? And the man looks and says, I wouldn't know. I'm from Alabama. And it was an extraordinary moment because if you think about America's narrative has been about freedom, equality, liberty, all the things that we believe in. And yet that reality wasn't true for many Americans, still isn't completely true. And so what we uncover is when we have a gap between what we say our narrative is and what it actually is in practice, then we have a real problem because the say-do gap can create cynicism and problems. So the importance of knowing who we are, what we're about, and why we do it. So each of these 10 factors forms into a system. You don't have to be – it's like the principles of war. You don't have to max all of them perfectly in your plan, but any you violate, if you don't have security, if you don't do something, you better know it and you better have a good reason why you don't because you've got a gaping hole. Vulnerability.
Well, and it's like the 9 characteristics of elite performance, right? You demonstrate all 9, but you don't demonstrate them in equal value all the time. You're playing on different ones that depending on the situation that you're in. And then even when you're being assessed as a SEAL, a Green Beret, a Ranger, then you're looking at some more critically than others based on the job that's being asked of you. So there's always this give and take with some of them. I want to ask about diversity. And I think that's an important one. And Lisa's laughing at me now from across the table. But I think it's a really important subject now. We did an episode not too long ago with an author. His name is Dax Devlin Ross, and he wrote a book on systemic racism, and it was called Letters to My White Male Friends. Generated the first hate mail I got on the podcast. So I figured I was doing something right.
Yes,
now we're having
exactly.
really difficult conversations. But Lisa, third female to graduate Ranger School, was in the first class. We joke about her path and my path through the course, and
he only took 9 weeks, so he is not a real Ranger.
Yeah, I didn't get the full value of the training by getting to do it.
You probably went in the summer too, right?
Yeah. I went in the winter, so I got a little bit of it.
But he is from the Northeast, so that's a different story.
But Lisa has the term delete the adjective, and that's a big part of her work and the theory that, we've got to remove the she, we've got to remove that adjective that sits before CEO or athlete or leader. You spoke a lot about diversity in the book. You speak about it in a lot of the work that you're doing, because there's a myopic view on diversity where people think, well, I have to get people in the room who are of different gender, of different color, of different race or creed, and then I've created a diverse audience. And what I say in this is, well, that's great, but if we all went to Harvard and graduated with the same degree, are we truly thinking with a diverse mindset? And so I wanted to get both of your thoughts on this from your different perspectives, because how we achieve diversity has to be quantified in who is actually sitting in the room and their background and their contribution from their experiences and what we call effective intelligence, one of those 9 soft characteristics.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that the way I think about it may be a bit different than some people, so it's important I frame my comments. First, equality of opportunity is a right, and it is a legal right and it is a moral right. And so we should seek to give everyone equality of opportunity. Now, that's hard. We're not close to that yet, but we should do that because it is morally right and legally right. That is not how I talk about diversity. When I think of diversity, diversity is different perspectives, expertise, and experience in the room. You don't do diversity because it's a legal right or a moral right. You do it because it's smart.
Right.
It's what works. In the book, we describe the Bay of Pigs. And what happens is President Kennedy gets a group of people in 1961, brand new president, gets a bunch of essentially old white guys. They weren't real old, but they were kind of World War II veteran white guys, because that was the government then. But what he really does is he gets people with a pretty limited set of perspectives. He asks the Joint Chiefs of Staff for their opinion, but they kind of don't want to give it. They're sort of haphazard. So he doesn't even get that perspective. And the thing, of course, goes badly wrong. It should have been evident from the beginning. And so what he didn't achieve was getting diversity of perspectives into the decision-making process. 18 months later, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he does much better. It's still a bunch of white guys because it's 1962 U.S. government. But the reality is he intentionally brings different perspectives into the room so that he can create the dynamic, which what he was trying to do was give himself a broader range of options. So I go to my own experience in special operations in the counterterrorist world. When I was younger, we kind of all looked like me, except everybody had bigger arms and, biceps and whatnot than me. Because we selected for that. And some of it was intentional and some of it was unintentional. We got into the fight after 9/11, really the fight against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that was the first time we were in danger of losing. Before that, you did operations. It was, you're going to do it well or really well. And suddenly we are in a specter of losing a war. And I was right in the middle of it. And we once had a meeting where we got key leaders together and asked if we'd already lost, and just too stupid to admit it. And what happened in the organization is we started becoming diverse, not because I put out a policy directive, but because we had to be a meritocracy. It really started mostly in intel and then in communications, but then it seeped across the organization because you needed the best people doing things at the best time. And people didn't want to hear your war stories from a previous war because that wasn't important right now. What was important was who could get the job done. And so we had a group of really great, largely females, but also there were other minorities and there's some older men and people of different demographics that became most valuable players. And the organization's social hierarchy started to be modified. And it started to be modified in ways that we didn't direct, but had a really important impact on us, which increased opportunities and whatnot. So in my opinion, now what you've got to do is you've got to understand that if you're looking at an elephant, you got 5 blind men, you better get them all together so that one's looking at the trunk, one's looking at the tail, and you can put that together. But you got to be thoughtful enough to put that together, and it's not comfortable to do. It's not getting your buds around you who were all at your wedding. Mm-hmm. It's getting the people who you didn't know before.
But it takes courage, and you have to have courage to have difficult conversations and be challenged. And that's, there's the element of humility in there. Yeah. Sometimes people don't want to hear it, especially if they're in charge, they've been in charge for a long time, they're, somewhat stuck in their ways. But Lisa, I want to get your thoughts.
I love the everybody went to Harvard example because the lack of...
Which is a good school, by the way. We don't want hate mail on
next
Harvard.
to West Point.
Although, I went to Boston University across the river, so there are rivals.
We are right next to the Yale campus. You better keep it down a little bit here.
Quiet.
But... the cognitive diversity. I actually read an article. So my drug of choice is when I fly, I buy the Harvard Business Review, a Coke Zero, and a chocolate bar. And that's my treat for traveling. And I was reading it. I ended up screenshotting, taking pictures of the Harvard Business Review where it talked about cognitive diversity because I've always been the token. I'm in a group of, again, in the military, worked construction, worked in the energy industry. It's predominantly male. Same demographic. And people are like, oh, we have Lisa in here. We have diversity. Really? Am I diversity? Yeah. I have long hair. That's the only thing that's different from me to the guy sitting next to me. But the cognitive diversity is where you start getting innovation. And innovation is where these creative business, it's easy to talk about innovation in the military. We don't really talk about it as much, but it goes across the board, different ways of thinking. But I do believe that when we force diversity, we end up losing a lot because the people in the room either are the same cognitively or they're so different that they can't come together and understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is everybody safe and comfortable? Okay, we're all going for that. I'm just going for it differently than you are. But if I can't have open and honest conversations because I don't have some sort of tie with the other people on the team, we lose the benefit of diversity. I do think, and this is something that I've been struggling with regards to the diversity topic, is with regards to getting a cornucopia-looking staff section, what is the benefit of recruiting somebody from a different demographic if you're not recruiting for that cognitive diversity? Are you bringing somebody in who has a solid root in a different culture that might think like you, but be able to advertise? And I'm thinking in the military about the CSTs, the combat support teams. They looked different, but they were just as motivated as the rest of the soldiers. So there are times where the visual diversity is also critical. So I'm all over the map with regards to diversity.
Let me ask you a opinion, because I want to throw to both of you a pet idea I've come up with in the last few years, and that is that the military largely is a guild. You have to enter at a young age and a young rank and work your way up. Can't be a captain unless you're a lieutenant, vice versa. As a danger, even if you start with, diversity at the bottom, you're all pretty similar by the time you're colonels. You've had very similar experiences and whatnot. I'm a believer we should have lateral entry to the military. I actually believe that at major, lieutenant colonel, and even general officer, we could bring in people from business. And I'm not talking about just an expert and treat them like a albino unicorn who sits in the corner. I'm talking about bring people in and put them in charge of brigades and divisions. Mm-hmm. I think I've run into business executives I think could walk in tomorrow, and I think they'd pump fresh air into what we do. And they've got enough smart people around them to have them not make any big mistakes militarily. What do you all think?
Can I jump on this today? I would love to. So I know there are in some specialties that does occur. In the engineering field, I have wanted to push for it more to have more technical engineering because military engineer training, it's, wooden nails and sometimes some concrete. And so there's a lot that's out there that we could pull in from corporate America that would be very beneficial to our military. But the system already exists. We just don't use it right. And that's people like me. I am a much better officer as a reserve battalion commander than I would have been had I gone single track. Yeah. And during my last deployment to Iraq, I was utilized all over the country and got sent to Muscat, Oman to advise at their engineering schoolhouse. Not because anything the Army taught me, but because of my work at Shell Oil Company and other businesses and knowing corporate America and knowing how to communicate with non-military personnel. We've got our contracting processes. Well, those don't fly outside of, DOD supported. So I think we operationalized our Reserve and National Guard, and we should be leveraging and pushing Reserve and National Guard to do more with their civilian careers and then pull them in as needed. And that's my humble opinion.
So you asked that question, you said that, and that's actually something that I've never thought about. And I think that's, if you look at organizations in the civilian world who do this, and I'm thinking about McKinsey, the McKinseys of the world, PwC, Bain, the big consulting firms. There are two tracks in there. You can come in as a junior analyst and work your way up, or you can come in as an experienced hire. And those systems work because they bring incredible value even coming in at a more senior level. Lisa, what you're talking about in your two worlds of being a reservist, and you go to your civilian job, but your civilian job is increasing your skills in parallel, probably at an accelerated rate, and in certainly a more diverse application, right? Meaning you're working on more projects that look much different in your civilian job than you would be if you were only gaining engineering experience through your military and the military projects that you're working on. So you're actually accelerating and growing a skill set at a much higher rate. Also thinking about the political environment. I mean, we put political appointees as ambassadors who come out of businesses, and some don't do well, but many do very, very well. Or, they go in as policy advisors, and they do very well out of their civilian experience. So I think you might be onto something.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when I retired, there's a bunch of my peers kind of wonder why we don't get invited to be the CEOs of companies and things like that. And then you just flip that and say, why don't we invite some of them to come in and be senior leaders in the military, not just appointees, but maybe, do we think our business is so much harder than every other business that nobody could learn it on the fly? Then you go to times like World War II when we had to bring people in, and arguably it worked pretty well in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as you know, you meet CEOs and executive leaders in companies all the time, and you say, that's one of the greatest leaders I've ever seen. And they never served a day in the military.
Right.
And they're amazing at what they do. I want to transition a little bit to Afghanistan. There's so many types of risk, and we'll quantify the Afghanistan conversation in maybe types of risk. There's, to name a few, economic, compliance, security, market credit, operational, strategic, reputational risk, business risk. I mean, the list can go on, and all of these types of risks would then have these sub-lists of different risks, and then also the threats and the vulnerabilities that you spoke about that will make up each one of them. We as leaders, I feel, rarely ever get to choose the situation that we inherit. And especially, you talked about progressing in the military, how many times you get thrown into a job and it's like, oh, guess what? Here's the shit sandwich. You just get ready. You got to figure this thing out. But we have to figure out ways to mitigate it. We're put in these situations. You were put in, and you led all forces in Afghanistan as the commander of the International Security Assistance Force. You led JSOC at a critical time with a growing organization that set an identity of that organization that permeates through today. You witnessed firsthand the effects of risk on our nation and the world, but you saw it not only on the effect on the countries that you operated in, but I would say on our most precious asset, our people, the military people and the civilian population. I told you we talked to Chris Miller and No One Left Behind in our 9/11 episode. We really got into Afghanistan, the effect that Afghanistan has had on people like Chris, yourself, who were there in the early days. And I was a college student. I watched it on TV and was motivated to go do great things after that. But you saw this whole evolution and lived it. And then you saw this withdrawal. You said that you would have advised leaving a small force there on the ground. When you were in command, your perspective was, in order to really win this thing and win this thing decisively, we needed 30,000 troops, 40,000 troops, and you had to go all the way in. But you also said that the president's decision was a courageous decision. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your perspectives on on Afghanistan, coming out of Afghanistan in the last couple of months, the driving factors behind it. But then also, when you sit at that level that you have, and you've been a part of these decisions, you have these 10 factors of control that you talked about. I mean, what is that checklist like?
Right. It's really challenging. And I'll start with that last point first. A country or an organization making tough decisions really has to have an effective risk immune system, because otherwise it can't go through the process to reach a rational decision that's really effective. If I go back to our challenge in Afghanistan, and you can go back as far as you want, but we'll go back to the mid-1970s when Afghanistan started to struggle internally. And they flirted first with socialism, and then they had a Soviet intervention, 1979. And they went through about 20 years, first of a fight against the Soviets, which was essentially a civil war. And then they had a civil war among the Mujahideen groups. And then they had the fight against the Taliban. So till 2001, it was torn apart for almost 2 decades. So then 2001 occurs, 9/11, and the United States and other Western nations go to Afghanistan, not because we were invited, not because they asked us to, but because it was in our interest to go after al-Qaeda, which had planned the 9/11 attacks from there. So we went in to do whatever we could to stop those sanctuaries from being a threat to the United States. And in so doing, we overthrew the government, which was a Taliban-controlled government. It wasn't our stated aim before, but that was an implied task in doing it. Now, once we did that, we were in a funny position. We had forced al-Qaeda at least to the hills. We hadn't destroyed them completely, but we'd eliminated the obvious sanctuaries. But then we're there, and Afghanistan has been torn by 20 years, and now it's got no government. And so what do? Can you walk away? And people made the decision for a couple of reasons. One, because we didn't want an al-Qaeda sanctuary to be established again, but also because when things are just torn apart in the economy and whatnot, you feel a moral and a practical obligation to set things in the right direction. That was a difficult point because the fall of 2001, we started a train of events without really clarifying for the nation where we were trying to go and what our national objectives were. I mean, we would talk about them occasionally. Our number one objective is prevent al-Qaeda's resurgence. Then a second objective is just avoid having an atmosphere inside Afghanistan that could allow a sanctuary. Then you start to, from that, derive the idea, well, therefore we've got to create sovereignty. Afghanistan's got to be able to control its borders and land to do that. And if they're going to create sovereignty, they've got to have a functional government. If they're going to have a functional government, they've got to have a security arm. So it's not very hard to get to the point where we've got to help the state of Afghanistan to stand up and exist in a viable way if we are going to achieve our first and stated missions of preventing the sanctuary. We kind of argued over that on and off for the first few years, but we really didn't do much in Afghanistan. I mean, the American people didn't realize it, but the level of effort was pretty low on the part of all the West. I was there initially when we stood up the Afghan army, and it was laughable. They literally sent a member of the administration around to Europe to ask for cash donations, almost like with a bag to get money. And they came back at one point with 600 Romanian AK-47s. And this was, okay, we're going to equip the Afghan army. You don't build an army getting someone to donate 600 Romanian AK-47s and get a bag of money. You've got to build up logistics, personnel. I mean, you've got to create something. And for the first 7 or 8 years, the level of effort on that and the police and the courts was minuscule. And part of that was the distraction of Iraq, but part of that was just the level of effort and a lack of clarity on just what the end state we wanted was. Then you get to 2008, 2009, and Iraq starts to be more settled and Afghanistan starts to get worse because the Taliban have gotten traction and come back. And we still had a difficult time deciding what our priorities, our national priorities were, what level of effort we were willing to put against those. And we signaled to ourselves and to the Afghan people and to our enemies that we had a limited level of commitment. We would love to have Afghanistan stand up as a sovereign nation. That would be great, but we're not willing to commit too much to do that. Kind of like playing poker with somebody. And you don't know what cards they have. You have an idea, but they are willing to see every bet and raise each time. And the Taliban, of course, they're not going anywhere. So they said, like the North Vietnamese did, they basically signaled to us, there is no level of effort that will make us quit. So unless you kill us all, there's no level of effort that will make us quit. We think there is a level of effort at which you will quit. And we even signaled to ourselves that we will never put more than a certain level of effort. And as soon as we can, we'll pull out. And so we are conflicted internally and signaling that externally, and they are not. And so you run into a mismatch, an asymmetric warfare, and when I talk about asymmetric commitment. And so as we go forward to Afghanistan, the Afghan people sense this. They understand that there's a limit to what America will do. And so they go through this increasing uncertainty, and I call it insecurity, almost like a child of a broken marriage. One parent has left, and then the parent comes back for a while, and they're always looking to see if that parent's going to leave again. And I think the Afghan people had a collective psyche that was convinced that we were looking at the exit, and as soon as we could, we would leave. And we routinely signaled that, although I don't think we intentionally did that. Then the Doha Accords, of course, signed, and we promised all American military would leave by 1 May 2021. So you've got a situation in which the Afghan people lack confidence in their own government, which had given great reason for a lack of confidence, but also they were just convinced that we were going to leave as quickly as we could. And the Taliban did a very good information warfare campaign over years to signal they were the inevitable winners. It's going to take a while, but we will win. So the Afghan people have this sense of insecurity. And then President Biden enters office. And so we talk about tough decisions. He's got really two options. He can abrogate the agreement that President Trump made, in which case you're going to extend the war. The Taliban are likely to start attacking Americans again. And President Biden will now personally own the forever war, which he doesn't want to do. And then the other option is to follow through on the withdrawal, in which case, even though his predecessor signed the agreement, President Biden's going to own it if, in fact, a sanctuary rearises. So he's caught between these two difficult decisions. Now, as I've told people, if they'd asked me what I would have done, I would have left a force there. And I think we could have buttressed Afghan confidence in their government. But I'm also honest enough to tell you I'm biased because I was there and I cared about the Afghan people. So I probably shouldn't have been given that decision to make because I walk in with a bias to it. And so whether it's a decision or a wrong one, I think President Biden's choice was courageous because he was going to get attacked no matter what he did. Now, the mechanics of the departure were unfortunate. I'm not as critical as some people are because I know how hard it is to withdraw a force out of a country like that, and to predict what was going to happen was difficult as well. But it was a very tough decision. Now, the question is, what does it mean now? Because we go back to what were our priorities and interests in the first place. The first is if we were worried about a Al-Qaeda or ISIS sanctuary growing, I think the chances of that happening are not zero, but I don't think they're huge, and I don't think they're greater than them going somewhere else and creating a sanctuary. You don't need big base camps and training camps to do that anymore. So much of this can be done with cyber and whatnot that I don't think that part of the danger is to the U.S. homeland is much increased. Now, in the region, you can say that a Taliban-run Afghanistan or a resumption of civil war is going to destabilize the region, and that's not a good thing. But again, it's probably not an international problem. Then the last one that is emotional for all of us, it's the reputational risk. We lost. There's no way to say we didn't because we didn't achieve our goals. And is that going to create a lack of confidence in us in the world? I'm not selling the domino theory from the Vietnam era, but there's a cost there, and we can't pretend there isn't. We are viewed as less reliable partners, less consistent, and less resolute than we would like to be considered. And so I think we've got to factor all that in. But we've got to navigate from where we are, not from where we wish we were. And so now what we've got to do is figure out what are our interests going forward and see how we best achieve those.
There's a quote from the book that I want to read here because I think it's really pertinent and important, and it's that some may argue that success means that a plan is good and execution effective, but that often's not the case. In combat, victory doesn't mean you got it right any more than defeat means that you did it wrong. There are just too many factors involved. I think you laid that out here. And I read this quote because it brings up this topic of after-action reviews, which certainly now there's a number of these things that are going to occur at a very deep level about Afghanistan, the global war on terror, because the withdrawal of Afghanistan really has, and they've been direct about that the global war on terror is over, right? And we can talk in a minute about, where do we go from here? But as you look at the global war on terror and having led our nation's counterterrorism force, how do you assess our performance?
Yeah. First, to the last point there, I think we don't decide if the global war on terror is over.
I would agree.
The other side gets a vote in that, and we'll see. There will be some kind of global effort against terror that will be required. But let's go back and see what I think we did well and what we didn't do. I think we made a lot of mistakes. You could argue, and I wouldn't disagree with this, that we have not had a significant attack on American soil since 9/11. We have been able to go back to international commerce in a way that was a question mark after 9/11, things like air travel and whatnot. The Middle East region has not turned out to be as stable and perfect as we would like it, but nor has it gone to a series of extremist-run regimes either. And so from that standpoint, it's not all is gone badly and not all is lost. Now, what did we not do very well? I think the first thing is I think that we misread how our response would be perceived in the world. We wanted to, after 9/11, be strong. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to go make those who did it pay for it. And there's a natural desire to do that. And there's a need not just to be victims who don't respond. But we wanted to respond in the most muscular way we could. So we used those muscles we were good at. We used major military units and things like that. And those, I think, were overused. And what we underused was effective diplomacy. We underused the ability to create people with language skills and cultural acuity. I used to argue when I commanded in Afghanistan, if I had 1,000 Americans that spoke Dari or Pashto, I could do away with a division because it's interacting with people. And that's the heart of what Green Berets should be. But we never had enough with the right skills to get out and provide the real long-term consistent interaction that I think would make the best difference. So we tend to do spasmodic, big responses with a lot of people that's almost by definition not sustainable because there's a certain period of time you just can't. They don't want you that long in that numbers, and you don't want to stay that long. And so you guarantee that you limit your long-term ability. So I think we made a big mistake there. I think the invasion of Iraq was a dramatic mistake for several reasons. One, I think Saddam Hussein was a bad person who did not need to be in power. But I also think that he was a little bit like rotten fruit, and at a certain point that was going to fall. And it's not necessarily our responsibility to go pull him out. He was also the keystone to the region at that point because the friction between the Sunni and Shia, read Iran and then the other Arab countries, once we pulled that out, we didn't have a plan for that. Mm-hmm. You pull it out, the pieces fall down. So what are we going to do after that? And so I think that was a major misstep. I think it was a level of overreach that proved itself to be problematic in the moment. Even if our occupation of Iraq had been less violent, it still would have been an issue because we still changed the dynamics in ways I don't think we were prepared to deal with. But, one of our challenges in any after-action review, as you know, they were developed really during the Second World War. And the real requirement was to figure out first what happened, because there would be a firefight and somebody would say, well, what happened? And then you would describe it. And people go, that would happen. He would know because he was there. Mm-hmm. Well, there are 100 people in the firefight. Everybody's got a different perspective of what happened in that firefight. And only truth only comes out of getting all those perspectives and knitting them together. Because you may absolutely have your view and it may be right in your truth because that's what you saw, but it can be so incomplete or so flawed that you draw completely wrong conclusions. So I think what we first need to do is go back and figure out what happened, what really occurred in all those places to the degree we can. And then we've got to be really honest with ourselves and say, don't look back to find each decision where somebody try to find a scapegoat, because I don't think there was a single decision maker that got this wrong. Mm-hmm. I think there were good people with good intentions trying hard, but we failed, which ought to scare us more, which means you can't just go find one person, get rid of them, and solve the problem. You've actually got to fix the processes that produced that. And what were the systemic weaknesses we exhibited? And those, I think, are things that should be addressed.
Well, you basically just talked through the DARL in the book. So DARL is the acronym for the Detect, Assess. Mm-hmm. But you talk through that. And I think it is very interesting talking about the after action review, because when we tie this back into leadership, especially at the higher levels, what do you own? What do you push down? And if you are pushing down decision making to a lower level, that doesn't mean you get rid of the responsibility. So that leads into the diversity of thought and everything else across the board of how do you really look at these when you're looking backwards. And one of my favorite sayings is that adversity doesn't build a person, it demonstrates their existing personality. And so that's goes back to exactly what your father told you of once the commander's in combat, that's how you know how he is as a combatant commander.
It's a great observation if you think about it, because if you do something and it goes well, we don't have a tendency to do real after-action reviews. We do celebratory after-action reviews. You did great, I did great, we all did great.
High five, all right.
Yeah, we are great. And if something goes wrong, we try to find that single flaw and fire that person or fix that thing, and then we want to walk out and go, great. But we did a study a few years ago, and what they found was 95% of all commercial airline flights fly with a flaw serious enough to cause the airplane to crash.
Thanks. I'm flying home later today.
Exactly.
Appreciate that.
I was chairman of the safety committee on JetBlue, and we didn't talk about that particular part, but the reality was every time there is a crash or something and they do the detailed investigation, they almost never find out that pilot Lisa fell asleep and crashed the plane. They find out there were a whole bunch of contributing problems, most of which have been around for a long time, and our systems didn't bring up, didn't identify, and they just happened to accumulate at some point into tragic failure. And so how do we create systems that take a hard look at what we do all the time and try to find those weaknesses, and then a culture that accepts that and says, I know we won by 4 touchdowns on Saturday, but what did we get wrong?
Right.
Yeah. How did we almost lose?
And there has to be a process that does this relatively quickly, because very rarely do you get to kind of put a pin in it and say, well, now we get downtime. Now we get a break to really assess this and spend 2-3 years. I mean, there's the next battlefield in this thing. And you're absolutely right. We don't get to choose what confrontation we're in so many times. I tell you, I was talking to General Jim Linder last night, and he would always tell me that the goal is to win the next war before anybody ever really realized that you were in this war and that it started. I spoke about Jack Devine. Jack Devine wrote a book called Spy Master's Prism recently, and Spy Master's Prism is about the cyber warfare and the hybrid warfare against Russia right now. We're kind of in this Cold War feeling with China almost, where, are we in a trade war? Are we not? Should we talk about it? We don't really know. Taiwan is kind of in the news now. General Craig Weldon, I had the opportunity to speak to, and his episode is going to come out here shortly. And he's working on hypersonic propulsion in response to China's ability to actually out-innovate us in the field of hypersonic propulsion. And think about the SR-71 is like the last time in the 1950s that the U.S. actually put money into hypersonic propulsion. And now the Chinese are actually fielding aircraft that have this. You were a graduate of West Point. You graduated the Naval War College. You've done fellowships at Harvard in the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the Council of Foreign Relations. You teach at Yale in the Institute of Global Affairs. You know better than anyone about diplomacy versus military action. You mentioned it a minute ago. I always say diplomacy is the final arm, military action is the final arm of diplomacy. But you understand the risks and the opportunities that are associated with both military action and prolonged diplomacy. When you look at these threats, Russia, China, unknown terror networks that may be out there that we don't even know we're in this fight with, where do you believe the focus needs to be? And what are the vulnerabilities that we right now have to quickly conduct these AARs and then say, apply focus here now?
I would take issue with you saying I'd know better than other people. I wouldn't, but I feel strongly that you've got the military capacity and then you've got the diplomatic capability. And I remember a quote back from my days at West Point, one of my courses that said, the purpose of the Spartan army was to give credibility to Spartan diplomacy. The purpose of Spartan diplomacy was to avoid having to use the Spartan army. And it's like the Mahanian fleet in being, the concept that if you have military power, it gives you the ability to influence actions whether you use it or not. If you don't have that capacity there, then you have fewer options because you've got no ability to threaten. At the same time, once you use it, and I would argue this with the war on terror, you show your enemy how long the dog's leash is. You know, how many times have you walked by a dog in a yard and you suddenly hear this barking and it runs towards you, but it's chained to a pole and it stops and you're outside of the length of that and you go, whew, good. Mm-hmm. You're never quite so scared afterward because you know that that dog can't reach you. And I think there's a limit to all military capacity. So once you use it, you essentially demonstrate its limitation. I think the apogee of American power was probably after the first Gulf War. We convinced the world we were a hyperpower. We could defeat anybody because we beat Saddam Hussein's vaunted legions, which wasn't that hard. But the bottom line is we used it and then we stopped and people thought, wow, these people can militarily do anything. I think by far our greatest risk right now is not our military capability, although I think that we are being threatened in areas where we've got to really focus and build like hypersonic weapons, but some other things in cyber and whatnot. We've got to increase our capability because if you don't stay at least at parity there, you take yourself out of the game. But I think the number one threat that is us now is our own dysfunction. If I was a foe of the United States right now, I would watch our news and I would conclude that we can't make decisions on what to have for lunch tomorrow. And that's because we have confused a two-party system with a war. And the importance of a two-party system is nobody can win completely or you destroy the very thing you rely on, the two-party system, which keeps you from going to the extremes. But if you have a winner-take-all mentality, then either party tries to take all. You're trying to defeat the one or destroy the one thing you're dependent upon, which is this two-party system. So I think the first thing is our own, and I'm going to call it not just political at the national level, but dysfunction and the tribalism in our society now. People look at us and they don't think that they are facing an America anymore, a united America. They're facing this thing that if they just step back and watch long enough, we'll tear ourselves to pieces. And the truth is, we might. I hope that that doesn't happen, but it's possible that we are losing so many of the things which we all agree on as being critical. And instead, we're leaning toward the things which divide us that we are going to look at as a group of entities, not as a single united nation. And that is, of course, terrifyingly weak. Then you step past that to the kinds of threats that I think are very real to us in the near term. I would say that information is the first, and that is aided by improved information technology now. But if I drew a scenario for you where on the eve of a political election, a story was put out about Lisa Jaster, who's about to be elected president, and the story could be completely wrong, but it comes out the day before the election, and a huge percentage of people go into the voting booth wondering if you have really stolen all this money or done the horrendous things that the story has. Now, maybe next week it comes out that says, no, that was completely untrue. That was fabricated. You can't undo that.
Right.
And there's always a group of people who are going to keep believing it anyway. Mm-hmm. And so the ability for disinformation, misinformation, which I say is unintentionally false, but disinformation intentionally, you can change the attitudes of populations almost on a dime now. And you can do it so fast, so inexpensively, and so convincingly that we are absolutely vulnerable to it. I mean, think of if somebody went after any one of us three and just decided to do a character assassination to amuse themselves. Mm-hmm. They could tie our lives in knots. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you extrapolate that to the national level, and that's, really scary. Then you step one from that and you go to cyber. The problem with cyber is the thing that makes our lives what it is now, the interconnectedness, is a source of incredible vulnerability. My wife and I bought a new refrigerator recently, and it's on Wi-Fi. And I go, okay, is it going to send me an email? Maybe. If I get one from the refrigerator, I'll be really concerned. But
you're low on milk.
Yeah. But the idea is we've got so many points of entry, so many points of vulnerability now. And if American society lost its cyber connectedness, I think our society would be torn apart in 48 hours. Mm-hmm. If you couldn't bank, if you couldn't do things, you would revert to kind of a post-apocalyptic set of behaviors where you would hoard everything, you would, have shotgun shells and whatnot, and you and your family defend in the homestead. That could happen pretty easily. Then you take one step from that and you go to our power systems or the distribution of fuel or the distribution of food. We have such interconnected dependencies now on all the things we live for our society just to work, just to function at its basic level, that it is just extraordinarily vulnerable to any kinds of attacks or just malfunction. Maybe someone doesn't attack it, it just breaks somewhere. And we need to step back and say, all right, all those things are good. I'm not arguing to do away with technology or connectedness, but we need to look at the resilience of that to natural disaster, to external attack, to, stupidity on the part of an operator, that sort of thing. Because all of those things threaten the existence and functionality of our nation as a society. And without those, everything else is kind of small stuff.
You reference in the book a bit about this, about, where we are in America, where do we have to go? I mean, this is, I mentioned this is our Veterans Day, discussion. I say a lot that America is not, it's a place. We know that. We can view it on a map. We live here. But more importantly, America is an idea. It's an idea of freedom, opportunity, equality, hope. But it is a tough time. As you mentioned, and we think about COVID, racial tension, hyperinflation, the political divide that you mentioned. And I would even throw in there that on the horizon, I don't think we talk about enough, but there's a generational shift in leadership coming in this country. And the leaders who have been in power for 50 years of our political system are soon going to become out of power. And who's going to fill that void? Who's going to fill that gap? And I think that that's such an unknown. It almost becomes scary if you start to think about it. But I also think about change. And I think about that change must first begin with an honest assessment of who we are, demonstration of humility, as we talk about. But after you understand who you are, then you have to make a commitment. There's got to be a willingness. And can I believe that I can make a change if I simply motivate myself enough to take a first step? It doesn't have to be a big step, just a first step in some direction. You said in the book, you referenced the Alamo, and you say that the crumbling old mission communicates values of selfless sacrifice and unwavering commitment to a greater cause. It reflects brightly how Americans want to see themselves and to be seen by the world, and has carried almost magical force for nearly 200 years. We sit on Veterans Day. We honor those who've served and fought for our nation. How do you think about Veterans Day? How do you think about America? And you spoke a lot about the things you have to do in terms of risk and the security piece. But as a culture, what do we do to come together right now?
Yeah. First, I think I would describe America as a promise. And it was a promise that if people came together, if they united and they stuck together, that they could create something that was better than what they had, the 13 colonies under British control. And ever since that, it has been a promise, often an unfulfilled promise, but it has been the promise that we can be stronger, more prosperous, safer if we unite. Now, what that promise also means that each of us makes a promise. It says that if we are willing to do those things to make fellow Americans more secure, if we're willing to sacrifice, if we're willing to serve, put ourselves at risk, pay taxes, all the things that are inconvenient and difficult, that we will get in return the promise of opportunities and justice and security that come with that. So it's a covenant basically among people that do that. And it's been pretty beneficial to the members. You get more from it, I would argue, than usually you have to commit, although people have given their lives because they felt it was just so important to maintain this. That idea is being challenged now. There is an idea that we have a different view of what America is in different parts of our society that is distinctly different enough that it's hard to say, okay, that promise applies to me. No, I view it so differently than you that we're not aligned on willingness to sacrifice, willingness to do those things, because I just don't agree with that promise as you do. That is scary. When I talk about the Alamo, what's so important is, there's a lot of complexities to the reality of the Alamo. There's a lot of arguments that the defenders were really trying just to position Texas to be another slave state. There were probably some nefarious characters and 180 plus people that were there. That doesn't matter. The reality of the Alamo is far less important than this story. Because if there were no Alamo, we would need that story. We would need a story of courageous people who are willing to stand up for the idea of liberty, the idea of independence, the idea of the values. And we need narratives like that give us guideposts that says, this is what we're willing to do, Bunker Hill. You pick it. And again, if you peel back the story so far that you try to find every flaw, the reality is you take away from the importance of the message. Nathan Hale, who was a young Yale graduate, and he was hung, and said, I regret that I only have one life to give for my country. It's a great story. We've named ships after him and all. He was actually a spy for like 6 days. He got captured right after he decided to be a spy. Okay, so he wasn't a very successful spy. That doesn't matter. Right. The fact that a person's willing to do that, once we lose the willingness to do that, then we've got big problems. The importance of Veterans Day to me is not that everybody that enters the service is a great soldier, because we all know not everybody is. We are not even the soldiers we wish we had been. Right. We all tried hard, did pretty well, but we know there were things about the way we were that were less than we'd hoped they'd be. And guess what? That's true of everybody. I don't think there's a single person who will live up to the kind of complete scrutiny that is available now. But we can't throw cynical with the idea. Because people are human and they are flawed, if they are still willing to go into the line, if they are still willing to do the best they can, if they're still willing to make mistakes, learn from them, and correct, then I think we've got to, as Frederick Douglass said, we've got to learn to take the good from people and discard the bad, because almost everybody you want to use as a role model. So I think Veterans Day reminds us that veterans are not these 10-foot tall superheroes that we just luckily find in society. They're just regular knuckleheads like us who go out and do it and, do it pretty well. And that's the key part. It's the fact that just regular people are willing to be a part of that and make that kind of sacrifice. As soon as we're no longer willing to make that sacrifice, as soon as people aren't willing to serve and aren't willing to do something hard, it's not a nation anymore. The very promise is now gone. And I don't think we're there. I don't think we're even near there. But we have to remind ourselves more than once a year on Veterans Day. Mm-hmm. We've got to remind ourselves more often that maybe it's not in uniform. Maybe it's in another form of service, that if we're not willing to make that kind of commitment, then we won't have what America's promise is.
Lisa, you are the mother of 2 young children.
Yeah.
You think about this conversation, we've applied it in a few different ways here, but when you look at your kids and you think about, the world they're growing up in and where we are in America, and I got two kids as well.
Right.
And, so fortunate that you got to meet them over the last couple of days. But what do we tell them? Like how do we inspire in them the ability to understand what this country is? And, and they're young, so they don't know, so much of the history that we can share. And especially coming from our perspectives and our experiences. I mean, our kids know most kids now, they were born after 9/11.
Yeah.
They haven't gone through that. And there's this kind of sheltered world of prosperity. And what do we tell them?
One of the things we did as parents when we lived in Houston is we actually took our kids out of the private school and we moved to a different area where there was a more diverse population in the public school. Nice houses here, okay houses here, apartment buildings over here, and all different shades, colors, and economic status in the school. And that was our way because our kids do live as, 2 veterans who have their own businesses. They live a pretty blessed life. And when I heard my children talking about what they saw on the news, that was almost a totally different world, even though it was 5 blocks from us physically, because they weren't exposed. And exposing our children to these different viewpoints and then letting them make up their own mind. My son just turned 13 on his 13th birthday. We had a huge conversation. Do you want to take the COVID vaccine? Now, you can feel however you want to feel about COVID and the vaccine and mandates, but if we want to raise the next generation of responsible adults who are going to carry the banner of America moving forward, you have to start forcing them to make decisions at 13. What do you want to do? Well, Mom, I don't know enough. Okay, how do we learn more? Let's look at how do we research? And it's a simple problem, but it's something where I felt very comfortable, regardless of what decision he made, that he could make this decision. There was a low risk for me, but for him, it was a life-changing event because he learned how to study. He learned where to look up what are responsible and reliable resources. And he talked to his friends and he talked to his friends' parents. It was a hard decision for him to make. So what do I tell my children with regards to our nation is we do have this promise, but to really live up to that promise, to be active, contributing members of society, we can't hide our heads in the sand. We can't yell into our own personal tunnels. We have to expand our viewpoints. We have to research. We have to start making the next generation make decisions so that they take ownership and carry the banner into the next decades to come.
Thank you. You've now given me so much to think about, as my son's 18 months. And so many times I'd look at him and I look at the news and I watch the news in the morning and he plays on the floor and I shake my head and I say, what are we going to do? And then I say, well, maybe he'll be a Green Beret and, and he'll solve it. We got to close out and ask all my guests. The Jedburghs in World War II, they had to do 3 things to be successful. There were 3 foundational core tasks. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, they had to be able to communicate. If they did these things with the highest level of execution every day, when challenges came their way, they could focus their energy on those challenges. You talked about physical fitness earlier being one of those things. You don't have to worry about it. You focus elsewhere. What are the 3 things that you do every day to be successful? But before you answer, I have to take away 2 of them. I've never done this before, but I can't make it easy on you. And I have to take away, tie your shoes and make your bed. So you don't get to use those 2. So besides those, what are your 3?
Well, you raised the bar. Yeah. I think if I break it down this way, the first thing for me is working out. And it's not because I want to be in great shape or anything like that, although I want to be healthy. That's how I keep myself centered. If I don't work out, the bad stand comes out. You'll know it later in the day if I didn't work out that morning. So that's sort of thinking about other people in an inward way. The second is to think about the things that I owe my family. I've been married for 45 years. I've got 1 son. He lives next door to us, along with my daughter-in-law and 3 grandchildren. So what do I have to do for them that day? And, it's not a lot I have to do, but the reality is I've got to be part of that life, that ecosystem in that life. And I got to figure out what's my role that day. And then the other is, what have I promised other people? I started a business when I got out of the military, so I've got a lot more people than just myself to think about. And what is my commitment to them? What have I either explicitly or implicitly said I do to hold up my part of that bargain? And some days it's doing a lot of stuff I don't want to do. Some days it's just all fun. But they are responsibilities. And you say, well, they're burdens. They don't feel like that. They feel like something that gives me a sense of I've got a right to be here. I've got a place because I have responsibilities. And I think that's the way every veteran should feel. Their responsibilities that they took on aren't negative things. They're kind of gifts because they give you this legitimacy to be here and to be part of this.
Work out, value our family, understand what we owe them, and what's our commitment and promise to others, and how do we execute on that. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates described you as perhaps the finest warrior and leader of men in combat that he ever saw. We never met before today, you and I'll tell you that in preparation for this, I spoke to several different senior leaders who had worked and met with you before, and they all reiterated that. And, I've learned that, and so honored to sit with you and experience that firsthand today. The 9 characteristics of elite performance that we laid out in the beginning, we threw them in here a little bit. We talked about demonstrating all 9, and at different times you weight them differently. If I had to pick one for you, I think about integrity. And it's the understanding of what's right and then acting on what's right for individuals, for teams, for organizations. You tell it like it is. You're honest with your direction and your feedback, but your focus is always on precision execution, on the mission. How do we achieve what we set out to do once we define that? A critical component of being a great leader starts with being a great person. It's very difficult to lead people if you're just not good yourself. But regardless of the room that you're in, whether you're sitting with a president of a nation or you're sitting with a private, you display equal levels of respect and admiration for that person and their role, which is truly a gift and a value that all of us as leaders should and must aspire to. Your career in the Army has proven that. Your work since you've gotten out in building a company continues to show in everything that you do every single day. You said dealing with risk is the active practice of controlling every single factor within your reach. And I would say that as leaders, we cannot escape risk. We must decide. We must act. We must act with integrity. We must think about others, understand our mission, and consistently execute with precision. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I'm so honored to have been with both of you today, and I look forward to so many great things to come from both of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. My honor.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh Podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh Podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.